Welcome to Dr. James Cousins' lecture series on Southern Alberta history recorded in 1974. Today, Talk 10 is about the part played by early railways in Southern Alberta.
It is fortunate that Lethbridge got its bridge and its opera house. That's the AR&I building. That was the opera house. It wasn't built until 1891, but in January 1891, they had piled all the material on the site, ready to build when the weather broke in the spring. So the opera house that they've been trying to get for so long, it's one of the things that I follow through, the necessity for a public hall. MacLeod had built one right early, and it was just about fallen down by this time. Lethbridge didn't even have one yet. But it's lucky they did, because 1891 was a panic year in the United States, and almost by association, Depression followed, and Canada followed the United States into Depression. It had been bad before, but the next 5 years were worse. The pattern in the United States was something like this. They had a large number of wildcat, overexpanded banks that went bankrupt like popcorn in Kansas on a hot summer day. The banks that survived then raised the interest rates and called in their loans so that weak enterprises became bankrupt. It was the age of the robber baron and trusts and mergers in railways and other companies. And of all the railway lines, only James J. Hill's Great Northern Railway didn't get into some financial difficulties because he had been smart enough to associate settlement and local improvement with his lines. He hadn't overextended. A lot of them were selling shares and using the money for riotous living. There were two dear old ladies down in the United States that kept selling shares all the time, a few shares at a time, and they lived very high on the hog, but they would keep expanding the capital of the company all the time until finally the company was like the tail wagging the dog. The debt was heavier than the trains were, and so they'd go bankrupt. Well, the same depression then resulted in the United States taking legislation against trusts and increasing its tariffs. The effect was that the railway to Great Falls didn't benefit Lethbridge, as tariff protection enabled the American lines to deliver coal to Great Falls cheaper than the Gulf Company could. It was in these circumstances that the Northwest Coal and Coke Company decided to turn away from railways. They leased their lines to the CPR in 1893 and turned to irrigation in an effort to attract settlers and perhaps make some profit from the land. Another footnote I have said the CPR took over that too by 1912. The picture didn't show any improvement immediately after 1896 when prices started to rise, because the boom had to spread its way across the prairies with Winnipeg as a base. We read in the newspapers of that time of soaring prices, crazy speculation, such as lots for riverboats to tie up at Brandon, Manitoba, and stuff like that. They were selling seafront area, waterfront dockage areas and so on, in places like Brandon, expecting a great trade by boat. Well, a number of developments occurred which made the Lethbridge area get ready, though, for that rush, which finally hit Alberta by 1905. Mr. McGrath says 1905 to 1912 were our boom years here. Well, now Mr. Bowman, in his book on railways, is where I turn now. In 1893, the CPR leased the Turkey Trail from the Alberta Rail and Coal Company and converted it to standard gauge. They'd been threatening to convert it to standard gauge for gosh knows how long. They even had ties, standard ties. All they'd have had to do was to move the rails out, but that would have meant a change in the rolling stock. Well, the interesting thing, though, by converting this to standard gauge was that they condemned the town of Dunmore to extinction, because they didn't need the coal transfer system any longer, and poor Dunmore had such high hopes with its hotels and its stores and its school district and all the rest. But Dunmore is no more. I don't remember even seeing Dunmore, do you? 6 miles from Medicine Hat, where this railway runs into the main line. But Dunmore Junction, when we were kids in school, you know, even in this country, we always had to study the names of rivers and the branches and railways and junctions and stuff like that, and so we had to learn where the junction at Lethbridge was at Kip, where it turned off to Calgary, and Dunmore, where it turned off into the main line and all that sort of stuff. As if that made any difference. But we learned words like terminus and junction and all sorts of funny words like that. Well, The Calgary and Edmonton Road had been started in 1890, and Mackenzie and Mann, who would be called Canada's answer to the crooked railwaymen of the United States, built the C&E south towards Macleod. Now I got this, I got Ernie Patterson doing a history of early Claresholm, and so a copy of his book is in the library, and I got that stuff from him. She has to make my students do work. Of course, they got credit for it in one of the seminar courses. And he said that the railway was finished to Claresholm in 1891 and reached Macleod in 1892. Now, when I say reached Macleod, that's another example of hyperbole, because the road stopped at the Old Man River about a half a mile west of where the present bridge is on number 2 highway. And the Gazette wailed at the injustice of it all. After all their high hopes of railways forming a network radiating from Port Macleod, they were reduced to getting their mail by buggy at a distance of 5 miles and across the river at that. So the railway really didn't help Macleod that much. It must have been frustrating to those poor fellows down there, especially the editor of the newspaper. Well, it was another 10 years yet before a trickle of settlers began to flow into the Claresholm district on that line from the north, about 1902 or 3. Now, in regard to railways, Mr. Ernie Patterson pointed out something interesting regarding railroad construction. He mentioned that Claresholm was built on a slough. Well, I know that Wetaskiwin was built on a slough, and so was Vegreville, because if you ever drank the water in those towns, you'd know it was an alkali slough to boot. And he said this was to make sure that they had a supply of water for the locomotives, and that stations were best sited in hollows, because this would prevent sidetracked cars from running away. Because he said if they had moved it to, I forget, a couple of miles east or something, and cars ran away, they'd run all the way to Macleod from Claresholm. I don't know whether they would bother stopping at Macleod either, but that's what Ernie said anyway. I suspect there's another reason why railways missed established communities such as Pincher Creek, well, remember Haneyville? Any of you ever hear of Haneyville? That was the Macleod station when the Crow's Nest Pass Railway was made. And they protested so loud that they got the Minister of Railways out, and he forced the railway to move in close to the town of Macleod, because the contract had said it passed through Macleod, and so they had to pass through it. It's interesting. I always suspected that these fellows put these places where they could sell the lots, and knowing the CPR, I wouldn't put it past them. Now, Mr. Bowman says that they didn't miss Pincher Creek because of that. He said because of the difficulty of getting around to the North Fork. But heck, you know, that railway goes this way, and Pincher Station is here, and Pincher Creek is down there. There was nothing in the world to stop them from taking a dip like that to get into Pincher Creek, but they thought they would move the town out here, and Pincher, and so-called Pincher now, was supposed to become the town, but the Pincher Creek people were very obstinate, and they stayed there. And nowadays, who cares about the railway anyway? See, this is the thing. For instance, old Vegreville was in a very pretty place down by a little creek. And Coppell would have been a heck of a lot prettier than Pile of Bones, but that's where they had to call it Regina to make it sound nicer. But, you know, there's nothing balder and muddier really than Regina, unless you're a fan of the Jolly Green Giants or something. Well, now, in the meantime, the Canadian government had become worried that the great mineral development at British Columbia was heading off south, while the CPR was away to the north about 150 miles. This left the field open for Mr. Hill's aforementioned tentacles to march north. And in Mr. Bowman's book on, what takes he call it? Railways in southern Alberta or something. He says that he mentioned by name 5 branch lines that had been driven north from Idaho and Washington into British Columbia to drain away the mineral wealth. So by act of Parliament in June the 25th, 1897, an act to authorize a subsidy for a railway through the Crow's Nest Pass was passed. Construction was started at once and went from Lethbridge to Nelson, or at least to Kootenay Lake. And I'll give you a little more about that later. But when then the settlement came, you can see what railways we have. We have a railway from here to Medicine Hat. We have one from here right through to British Columbia. And we have one from Macleod. By 1905, they did get into Macleod, north to Calgary. And that was about all they had, with this exception. There's one more railway to be mentioned in the process of getting ready, and that was the St. Mary River Railway, an extension of the narrow gauge from Stirling to Cardston between 1900 and 1902 in connection with irrigation development. There was a later 15-mile spur from Raleigh to Kimball. Sounds like the abandonment of railways, doesn't it, in reverse? They're putting them in here. The completion of all narrow gauge lines was completed by 1909. Of interest to local citizens is the fact that the whole line from McLeod to Lethbridge was relocated between 1907 and 1909 with the building of the viaduct. And when I wrote that, I had an idea that Mr. Robert Gardner would have his booklet out shortly, but he hasn't got it ready for publication at all. So if he does, there'll be a book on the building of the great viaduct across the river at Lethbridge. As Mr. Saunders would have said in 1890, the route would have cut off several miles between here and McLeod. Remember when he said he wanted to go down the round street coulee and cross the river and come up the other side? It would cut off several miles between here and McLeod. Well, that's exactly what that bridge did. Other local lines were built later, but they were usually to meet the needs of settlement. The CPR had taken over and extended all the Galt lines by 1912. The Kip-Alderside line was built between 1907 and 1911, and that will influence the founding of the towns on that line, which I have in here somewhere, but I probably never get down to it. And then the Suffield-Retlaw line to the irrigated area around Vauxhall was built in 1913 and extended to Lowman in 1914. And the Stirling to Foremost line was built about the same time. The First World War and the dry years afterwards cramped construction until the 1920s. And in 1923, the Lethbridge to Foremost line was extended to Saskatchewan to meet a line coming from Winnipeg. The Kip to Turin line of 1925 was an irrigation line. This railway was supposed to link up with the Retlaw line, but it never did. Hill Spring had an extension in 1927, and the Scandia line it was finished in 1928. But apart from a few link-ups, there were no more railways built after 1930.